There is a number that belongs to Edwin Moses in a way that no other number in the history of track and field belongs to any other athlete. 122. Not a world record time, not a championship total, not a points tally from a decade of competition. 122 consecutive races in the 400-metre hurdles without a single defeat. From September 1977 to June 1987. Nearly 10 years of competition at the highest level of a brutal event that asks more of the human body per race than almost anything else the sport produces. 10 years of showing up to starting lines around the world and leaving them having won. Every single time. At 69 years old, sitting with a distance from competition that most athletes never fully achieve. The distance that allows honesty rather than strategy. Edwin Moses named the hurdlers he considered the greatest the event had ever produced. Not the ones he had simply beaten, the ones he genuinely believed belonged in a conversation about what hurdling at its absolute ceiling looked like. 5 names. 5 different expressions of what the event could demand from a human body when that body was prepared to give everything it had. The 400-metre hurdles is not a sprint with obstacles placed in the way. It is something more complicated and more demanding than that description suggests. It requires the speed of a sprinter, the endurance of a middle-distance runner, and the technical precision of a jumper, all operating simultaneously across a distance that does not allow any one of those qualities to compensate for a deficiency in the others. The athletes who reach the top of this event are a specific kind of complete. They have solved a problem that most elite athletes cannot fully solve even with years of dedicated preparation. Moses solved it better than anyone in history, and at 69 he was willing to name the 5 who had come closest to the level he had set. Number 5. Harald Schmid. The man who was always there. The presence that never disappeared regardless of what Moses was producing. Harald Schmid of West Germany spent the late 1970s and the entire 1980s occupying the space directly behind Edwin Moses in a way that required genuine excellence to maintain. He was not a nearly man in the conventional sense, the athlete who approaches the top without the tools to reach it. He was a legitimate world-class hurdler who in any other era would have been the name the sport built its narrative around. In the era of Edwin Moses, he was the perpetual silver medal. The proof that the standard Moses was setting was not just fast relative to the average. It was fast relative to the genuinely extraordinary. Schmid ran under 48 seconds multiple times across his career. He won European Championship titles. He competed at the highest level for a decade with a consistency that the results tables document clearly. And he did all of it while watching the man in the next lane produce times that made his own best efforts look like they belonged to a different level of the event. Moses said that what Schmid gave the event during their shared era was something that dominance alone cannot provide for itself. Genuine, sustained, high-quality opposition that forced the standard higher simply by existing. A decade of competition in which the second-best hurdler in the world was genuinely exceptional made Moses better than he would have been competing against a weaker field. Schmid never broke him, but he made the breaking harder. And that, Moses acknowledged at 69, deserved its own category of recognition. Number 4. Danny Harris, the teenager who did what nobody had managed in nearly 10 years. Danny Harris was 18 years old when he finished second to Moses at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, running 48.13 seconds in a performance that announced his arrival at the highest level of the event with a clarity that required no further explanation. He was young enough that the result could be filed under promise rather than achievement, the kind of performance that suggests what is coming rather than what has already been delivered. What came 3 years later was the result that defined everything. Madrid, 1987, a Grand Prix meeting that would have passed without lasting significance in any other circumstance. Harris ran 47.56 seconds. Moses ran 47.69. The streak ended at 122 races. A 10-year period of unbroken dominance in the 400-metre hurdles concluded not at an Olympic final or a World Championship, but at a regular season meeting in Spain, beaten by a 21-year-old who had been watching Moses win races since Harris was still in high school. Moses said that the ending in Madrid contained something he had not fully anticipated. Not the defeat itself. He had understood intellectually that every streak ends and had prepared himself for that reality across the years it continued. What he had not fully prepared for was the specific feeling of being beaten by someone who had learned to hurdle by watching him hurdle. Harris had studied Moses the way a student studies a text, had absorbed the stride pattern, the race management, the technical approach that had made Moses unbeatable for a decade, and then had used that knowledge to produce the result that finally ended what a decade of competition had failed to end. Moses called it the most honest compliment the event had ever paid him, being beaten by someone who had built their greatness directly on the foundation of your own. Number 3. Andre Phillips. The man who arrived at exactly the right moment and took exactly what was available. Andre Phillips had spent years competing in the era of Moses and producing results that would have been celebrated as exceptional in any other context. He was consistently fast, consistently present at the sharp end of major competitions, and consistently denied the gold medals that his talent deserved by the simple fact that Edwin Moses was competing in the same event at the same time. Seoul 1988 changed that equation in a way that Phillips had spent years preparing for without knowing if the preparation would ever produce the result. Moses was 32 at the Seoul Olympics. The streak had ended the previous year. The era of complete dominance was concluding, and the question of who would inherit the event was one that the field was actively competing to answer. Phillips ran 47.19 seconds in the Olympic final, an Olympic record at the time, and crossed the line ahead of Moses in the race that marked the clearest passing of the standard from one generation to the next. Moses acknowledged that what Phillips did in Seoul was not simply a victory. It was a statement about the nature of preparation and patience in a sport that does not always reward either quality on the timeline the athlete chooses. Phillips had spent years being the best hurdler in the world who was not Edwin Moses. He had maintained the work, the commitment, and the belief across a period when the evidence available suggested the result he was building toward might never arrive. And then it arrived, in the most public way possible. At 69, Moses placed Phillips at number 3, not because the Seoul result alone demanded it, but because of what the entire career represented. A man who stayed in the event long enough and worked hard enough that when the moment finally opened, he was ready to take it completely. Number 2, Kevin Young. The man who took the one thing Moses had believed might never fall. Edwin Moses set the 400-metre hurdles world record at 47.02 seconds in Koblenz in 1983. It was a time so far beyond what the field was producing that the sport spent nearly a decade treating it less as a record to be broken and more as a ceiling that defined the event's outer limit. Moses himself had never broken 47 seconds. The record sat at 47.02, close enough to the barrier to make it feel reachable in theory, far enough away in practice that 9 years of elite competition had not produced a serious challenge to it. Barcelona 1992. Kevin Young ran 46.78 seconds. The barrier fell by a margin that made the result feel less like a progression and more like a rupture. Not 46.99 or 46.95, the kind of improvement that suggests an incremental advance on what had come before. 46.78, a time that reframed the entire historical conversation about what the event was capable of producing and placed Young in a category that required its own assessment rather than a simple comparison to the records that preceded it. Moses said that watching Young run 46.78 in Barcelona produced in him the specific feeling that Wade van Niekerk's 43.03 would later produce in Michael Johnson. Not bitterness, not the competitive resentment of a man whose record had been taken. Something quieter and more honest. The recognition that what Young had done was genuinely beyond what Moses had believed the event would allow in his lifetime. That the ceiling he had spent his career approaching had been not just broken, but moved to a position that made his own best efforts look like they belonged to an earlier understanding of what was possible. He called it the greatest single performance in the history of the 400-meter hurdles. The record still stands. Number 1. Karsten Warholm. The name that arrived after Moses had been retired for 30 years. The athlete who did to the 400-meter hurdles what Moses himself had done in 1976, arrived without sufficient warning and produced something the sport had not seen before and did not know how to fully process. Karsten Warholm of Norway won the 400-meter hurdles at the Tokyo 2020 Olympics in 45.94 seconds. A world record by more than 3/4 of a second. A time that did not just break Kevin Young's record of 46.78, it made the record look like it belonged to a different event. The margin of improvement was so large that the athletics world spent weeks after the race trying to find a framework that could contain what it had witnessed. The fastest 400-meter hurdles in history by a distance that exceeded all projection. Moses said that Warholm represented something he thought about differently as the years passed. The understanding that greatness in an event is not a fixed destination, but a moving standard that each generation finds and then exceeds. Moses had been the moving standard for a decade. Young had moved it further. And then Warholm had arrived from Norway with a running style that violated several conventional assumptions about how the event should be executed and produced a result that forced the entire history of the discipline to be reread. He placed Warholm at number 1 not because the record alone demanded it. Records can be produced by circumstance and conditions and a single perfect day. He placed him there because of what the Norwegian had done to the event's understanding of itself, because of what 45.94 seconds communicated about the distance between where the 400-meter hurdles had been and where it was now capable of going. Moses had spent a decade defining the ceiling of his event. Warholm had arrived 3 decades later and moved the ceiling to a position that made Moses' own dominance look like the beginning of a conversation that was still being written. At 69, Edwin Moses named 5 hurdlers who had shaped what the event was and what it had become. The streak, the science, the decade of winning that no athlete in any track discipline has come close to replicating. He built the standard, and the greatest compliment the event could pay him was producing athletes good enough to eventually exceed it.